Welcome to the Learning Can't Wait podcast, a Full Mind production. At Full Mind, our vision is to ensure every child has access to an exceptional education. Each episode, we will be joined by pathfinders within and around the education space who are bringing about transformational change on behalf of deserving students. I am your host, Hayley Spira-Bauer. Welcome back, everybody, to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. I'm so excited to continue our mini-series on rural education with Dr. Amy Price Azano, a professor at the School of Education at Virginia Tech, as well as the founding director of Virginia Tech's Center for Rural Education. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited for you to be here. You know, in addition to your extensive knowledge on rural education, schools, setting them up, supporting teachers, you also teach teachers who become rural educators. So I have a lot of questions to ask you.
Okay. Sure.
To start us off, though, I'd love to know how you came to be the personal and professional version of yourself.
Oh my. Well, I'll say that with that kind introduction that I'm probably more comfortable with Amy Sue. So that's part of my personal identity, I guess. I come from a very small rural town in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. And so when I think about sort of how I've arrived as a professional in this space, it definitely goes back to my earliest memories of being a rural kid myself. And, like many, when you grow up a particular way, you don't know that that's unique or that, you're really developing a superpower. You don't know that. You're just growing up in a community or with your family. And so it wasn't until I left my rural space of Luray, Virginia. I was a first generation college student, my sister and I both. And so when I left my community, it was when I realized that I had an accent, that, not everybody, has biscuits and gravy on Saturday mornings, or that, you have these particular traditions that I grew up with and that were a big part of my life. And so I think it was later that I realized, that it was later when I realized that there were a lot of rural stereotypes that came with being particularly from Appalachia. And so that really shaped the way that I sort of moved through college when I became an English teacher myself in urban and suburban spaces. And really when I was able to kind of see the contrast between, the opportunities that I had as a young person, which were rich and plentiful, but not ways that were necessarily valued in formal schooling, and the contrast between that and what I was seeing as a teacher in suburban and urban spaces. And so that created a bit of a rub for me and took me back to graduate school to become a scholar in rural education.
Your origin story, as I sometimes call it, is so interesting. I love how you have the purview of multiple types of learning environments and then return back to your roots. You know, when you think about your own education, you shared a few anecdotes that really highlight what it was like. But what does rural education mean to you? You know, I've had the good fortune now of meeting many rural teachers, rural educators, leaders, etc. But when you think about what makes rural education beautiful and unique, what would you say sticks out in your mind?
Gosh, that's a great question, Haley. I think rural education to me is it's opportunity. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of seeing where our food and energy and water come from. It's a way of seeing where our poetry and our natural habitats come from. It's endless opportunity. I think the challenge that many of us and other, rural ed folks that you've had on your show are talking about is that there's that opportunity or that beauty is not always valued in the same ways not that they're not valued by policymakers or people in cities. I'm not suggesting that, but I am suggesting that sometimes we get overshadowed, and that there's not a lot of place conscious thinking when we think about educational policy or the ways that rural schools are unique, that our geographies and our communities make us unique. And that's true for any community. But I think that in rural spaces, we sometimes have a little bit of a challenge of, out of sight, out of mind. And so I think that that's a lot of our work, that we are scholars and we're researchers, but we're also huge advocates. We're advocates for the rural teachers that are doing the hard work, the principals and superintendents, and of course the learners that are in those rural schools and communities.
So obviously you're very passionate about this topic and you even founded the Center for Rural Education. Talk to our listeners about what do students, I mean they're adult students, but what do adult students, what can they expect if they become a part of the Rural Education Center?
Sure. Yeah. So, I am not unlike many of the colleagues that I have in this space. So, a lot of us, we come to rural education through another discipline. So, for example, I was an English teacher. I taught English and creative writing, and I loved being a high school English teacher. But when I was looking at PhD programs, those were the programs that were available: literacy programs, reading, English education. And so the context for that work was rural, but the content was something very different. And it was like many, again, of my friends and colleagues in rural education, it's kind of this aha moment we have in grad school. We're like, wait, people study rural education? That's fascinating, right? Because at other universities, there are, centers or urban studies. That's an entire discipline. But I think that, we kind of find that, that space for studying rural education. And so as I became a professor, I was teaching teachers, and mostly in the space of the humanities, like preparing teachers to teach English or history and social studies. Um, and then every once in a while, I would get someone, who was from a rural area, or that's really what they were interested in. And so um, there are a lot of us at different universities and also at Virginia Tech who are doing space in rural education, or also in the like rural, sort of ecosystem, like rural communities, rural public health, different disciplines that influence rural schooling. And so to create a Center for Rural Education at Virginia Tech was critically important to me as a scholar, to find my community, to find those people, because I'm not the only one doing it, but there wasn't really a place for us to land. And so it's been a wonderful opportunity to connect with people outside of my college and across the university who are also deeply invested in the opportunities and experiences of rural learners. And so for students coming to us, I work mostly with graduate students, PhD students who also want to become rural education scholars. And when they find the center, they're really excited, because they're like, I didn't know this existed, or they found us. One of my newest students is from Malawi, and so she is deeply interested in rural education in Africa, and she was looking for programs in rural education, and she found the Virginia Tech Center for Rural Ed, and now she's starting her second year here. In Blacksburg, Virginia, was her first time to the United States. So it already has, we're already feeling, how it's resonating just beyond Blacksburg and Central Appalachia, but it can have a pretty far reach if we continue to grow the center.
That's incredible. Do you have the statistics about what percentage of your students are from rural America? Do you
Oh,
know?
for the ones that are involved in the Center for
Yes.
Rural Ed, I
Yeah.
would say 100%. Like, I'm
Yeah.
just thinking very quickly, but yeah, I
Yeah, you're
mean,
like, quick count.
yeah, yep, quick count. And if they're not from a rural area, there are lots of people. Like our most recent, one of the things that our center has been doing is sponsoring a rural education scholar in residence program, and so that's we're able to connect with people from around the university that way. And one of our recent scholars in residence is Dr. Hannah Scher, and she's a professor in our College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and she grew up in Minneapolis, I'm pretty sure. And so she doesn't come by way of like her learning experience herself, but as a ag professor has become deeply invested in rural communities. And so it's not we're not gatekeeping in any way here, and it's wide open. You're from New York, you could, and right, like
Super
you told me you
interested.
learned about rural and now you're all in. So like
Yes.
we meet a lot of folks like that who especially here at Virginia Tech, because we are situated in Central Appalachia. We're in a beautiful part of Southwest Virginia. And so, if you haven't thought about rural spaces before, and then you find yourself living in Southwest Virginia, you learn to care pretty quickly. And so it's also, an open and welcoming hub, I think, for those folks who find us as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure as you continue to grow, you're going to find all types of people. Like as you continue to reach more continents and countries, you'll continue to expand all the different mindsets, which I think is probably the goal about rural education in America.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, for students that are in their pursuing their PhD and they're studying rural America and they're studying rural education in America, what is it that they can expect from their coursework? My familiarity, as I mentioned before, is in urban and suburban settings. And my entire teaching career is in urban setting. So I did a ton of learning about the uniqueness of urban environments and you know, talk us through, like, again, sorry to put you at like ground zero because I know that for folks listening who are unfamiliar with rural education, many of them are at ground zero about what education looks like in rural America. But how does the coursework differ from your work at the School of Education in the rural education setting? Like, what are the kind of pathways that people are studying? Like, how is your focus unique?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm really lucky. I'm a professor in the School of Education, and our School of Ed is deeply committed to rural spaces. So we have lots of folks. My name's on the center as the director, but there are lots of faculty members who I partner with and collaborate with in this space. And so the students who come and work with us in the Center for Rural Ed, the doc students are often doctoral students in foundations of education, which is a more traditional program that you would find at lots of different universities. We also work with students in counselor education, um, ed leadership, educational leadership. So higher education, so different students, like I was saying before, who have maybe a different content area or a different discipline, but they are passionate about rural spaces and what their content or discipline looks like in a rural community. So those are the students that we tend to work with. So, but for the students who want to study rural education, what they would find is that they are able to take courses that we've created at Virginia Tech, so that they don't have to do what I did and what many of us did, was find that person who would do an independent reading list with them, or do that work. So we have a course in the foundations of rural education at Virginia Tech. I did a research course, a rural education research class, to really understand like what makes research with rural communities different and unique, and what are the dispositions and sensitivities and the nuances that a researcher would want to think about when they're working in rural communities. This semester, I'm teaching a class in policy. So, thinking about rural education policy and the ways that policy desperately needs to be place specific or place nuanced, so that it can serve rural places in the same way that it might serve non-rural areas. And so those are some of the classes. We also have a class that we've created on place-based pedagogy that we're hoping to have more embedded into our undergraduate program for pre-service teachers. So yeah, so I'm partner. I'm a professor in the School of Education, and then the Center for Rural Education is the other part of my job. But we work together very closely to make sure that what we're doing in the Center for Rural Ed also serves not just the students who think of themselves as future rural teachers or rural scholars, but also to the benefit of anyone who's a pre-service teacher, even if they end up in an urban or suburban place, right? To have some of those courses in rural education, that will only help them, advocate for those spaces as they move about throughout the world. So
I love that. Yeah, having the mindset, you shouldn't only be learning about the context in which you're teaching. You should be learning
absolutely,
about all the context of education, not so
absolutely,
borrowing, right? Because best practice is best practice, and so you can learn.
that's right.
I know one of your principal areas of research is equity issues in rural education, and as you know, just from our time together before we recorded today, equity in education is a focus area of mine. So let's talk a little bit about what equity issues you are most encouraged by or most passionate about and focused on in your work today.
Sure. So, what I've done a lot of work in as a around equity challenges is around youth talent development for rural communities. So I call it talent development because sometimes when I say gifted education, people bristle a little bit because there's a lot of strong feelings and it becomes politicized when we talk about gifted ed. But so I would encourage listeners to not be distracted by that, right? Like I'm talking about talent development in rural spaces. And so when we think about that as an equity challenge, it comes to a conversation about how schools are funded in America. And so that's another podcast. Like that's another, you can
I
have me
feel
on
like there's
that.
a lot of questions there
Yeah,
to spawn.
we could also talk about that, but assume that you know what we're talking about and that
Mhm.
there's a huge equity challenge in the way that we fund schools. And so in Virginia, for example, we're shaped like a triangle, and I'm down in the far, left corner in Southwest Virginia, and up at the top of that triangle is Northern Virginia, and it's the DC metro area. And a lot of people refer to that space as Nova, so Northern Virginia. And I often make the joke that I'm from Rova, which is the rest of Virginia, right? So we're this really big state. We're also a very rural state. The rural populations in Virginia map onto the national percentages, about 20% or 1 in 5 students in Virginia as a rural student. And so where I live and work in Southwest Virginia, a lot of our school districts they have about a $10,000 per pupil expenditure. In Northern Virginia, by comparison, that's almost a double. A lot of the, big schools that you've heard about with Arlington, Fairfax, Alexandria, are closer to $20,000 per pupil. And so just starting at that, right? Like we don't even really need to have much more of a conversation to know that
Sure.
if you have double the amount of money, right, that you might have double the resources. And so what does that look like for programs like talent development? Um, it has huge consequences, right? And so especially for programs that people might see as, extra. And so I say that because I think that a lot of times we talk about the sustainability of rural places, or when people have conversations about like what rural needs, I always come back to this idea of like, where do we develop the talent? Where do we nurture those students in elementary school or middle and high school? And there's often a lot of attention on secondary opportunities for dual enrollment and AP and college going, who goes to college, who stays, who completes. But where do we begin that, right? Is with, looking at those first and second graders and finding out like who in this, like who could benefit from some enrichment. And so if we think about it, just, sort of like in that basic tenet, right? Like who would benefit from enrichment? And then think about that enrichment reinforcing what we said at the beginning. If rural education is opportunity, if rural education is beautiful, and we know that people want to stay in rural spaces and want to thrive there and benefit and have a living wage and be successful and all of the things, right? Then let's develop that, and then in those enrichment programs have those be place-based and rural focused. And so a lot of my work has addressed not just the equity challenge that there is an opportunity gap between rural and non-rural spaces, but then also what can we do pedagogically? What can we do with a curriculum to make sure that we're reinforcing that rural is important and rural is valued, and to embed that into the gifted curriculum. So I've done lots of studies. I've had lots of grants doing that kind of work, and then probably something I'm most proud of is that we've taken that research and it has sort of manifested into a summer camp that we have at Virginia Tech, where it's for gifted or high achieving rural middle school students, and they come, and it's a residential camp. They come on campus for a week. It's called CVT, so Summer Enrichment Experience at Virginia Tech. So they get to CVT, they get to see Virginia Tech. But what's different is that we're trying to not drive home this message that you have to go to college or you have to go away to be great or to be something special. So what we do at that camp is it's all rural focused, it's all place based, so rural communities are at the middle of every course that we have. And so it's a great way to kind of bring to life, sort of like taking the equity challenge, studying it, but then doing something. We're trying to now be at the part where we're addressing it.
It's cultural competency at its finest, right? Like it's meeting kids where they are, it's using their context and their environment to shape their education and be contextually relevant for them.
Absolutely,
It's just
absolutely.
in a different way than I think a lot of the mainstream dialogue discusses when you talk
Sure.
about cultural competency and
Yeah.
some of the political debates about that. This is maybe, as you mentioned, gets less attention. It's
Mhm.
not getting as much focus. Hence me wanting to focus on it here because I think there's such an audience for it. Most of America is rural. Maybe not not dense population, but not
But
population
geographically, you're right. Yeah.
geographically, not population density. Thank you.
Yep, yep.
most of America is rural. And so when we're talking about rural America, we're talking about America.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, that summer camp sounds incredible. When is that? It's coming just a
That
couple
is, it's coming up in now in June. Yeah. So we're just a
uh,
couple weeks out from having 50 middle schoolers show up on campus. So we're very excited.
by the time this airs, it might actually be
Oh, wonderful.
real time. So for the listeners, it might be real time. What else is on the horizon for you? Like what's has you excited about the future for the Center for Rural Education?
Yeah, well, we have two things on the horizon. So, one of the things that we've been really focused on in the Center for Rural Education, especially where we're situated in Central Appalachia, is to drive home the message that rural spaces they're not a monolith. They're not all white. They're not monolingual. They're not all heteronormative. They're not all of these things that I think, again, get put on to rural schools and communities. And so, when we first launched the Center for Rural Education, we did so with a real intentionality of making sure that we had equity at the center of all of our work. And so one of the each year, part of what the Center for Rural Education does is it hosts a Rural Education Summit. And at that very first summit in 2022, I invited a childhood friend of mine, Estella Knott, who has a Mexalachian band called the Lua Project, and you can find them luaproject.org. But so she grew up biracial, multilingual. Her mom was from Mexico, and again, this is a very small town, so all our parents, we all grew up. Our parents are friends. We all grew up in the same church, and so I've known her for a long time. But they have a brand of music that they call Mexalachian, where they take a lot of the folk traditions, both of Mexico and of Appalachia, and they do what her group calls they do cultural pollination. So they're cultural pollinators, and so they were our musical guest at that first summit. And recently, Estella and I applied for we applied for a grant together, and we were successful. And it's from the Mellon Foundation, and it's called Monuments Across Appalachian Virginia. Is the grant from the Mellon Foundation, and our piece of that is something called the Montanitas Reimagined. And so we are creating a monument to celebrate the Latine Appalachians from our part of the world in the Shenandoah Valley, and we're putting on a festival this September. The Lua Project is releasing a digital album, and so it's just really exciting because we get to partner not just with each other, but we're also partnering with the Veterans of Foreign War, the VFW in Luray. My dad's a member, so it's very familial. It's very, it's a full circle moment for me personally. So that's very exciting. And then the other thing that we're doing this year's Rural Education Summit, continuing again in that line of really keeping equity at the focus of our work, this year, our theme is Rural for All. And so we are focusing on rural education and queer identities, the intersection of those complex identities that people hold in rural spaces, because there are a lot of queer folks in rural spaces, and we want to make sure that they are valued and seen, and that we have queer affirming pedagogies in our rural schools. And so we are just really excited to host that this October.
That's a lot to look forward to.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. We are.
I imagine that you're bringing in people from all types of rural settings all over the country and maybe even the world, for your earlier comment about who's joining in at the center these days, and really will have such a profound impact on people returning to their communities and bringing what they've learned into their schools and into their classrooms.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm actually my former doc student, Clint Witten, and I have a book that we're co-editing called Rural Education and Queer Identities, Rural and Outrooted. And so that book, we are wrapping it up now. It comes out next year. And so we're really hoping that the book and also the Rural Education Summit this October really highlights that work and makes people excited. And again, we're sort of also hoping to open up the field of rural education to people who might not readily think of themselves as that way. That's what we found when we put out a call for book chapters, is that people are like, well, I'm not really a rural person. I do this other work. And I'm like, no, you get to be rural.
Yeah.
You're doing really important work. So yeah, so again, just trying to sort of open the field in that way as well, as another one of our aims, I guess, here at the center.
one of the themes that came across in almost every single recording I've done with rural school leaders and folks working in rural spaces is the idea of collaboration. And you've really highlighted that without outright naming it. The spirit of rural America is this we help each other, we work together, we collaborate for the betterment of our communities. And so, even without openly naming it, you've carried that spirit here in this conversation as well. And it feels so authentic. Like I know
Oh,
it's
that's
true
great.
now because everybody has basically alluded to it or even just given examples that highlight that in ways that feel so unique and special.
Oh,
To
thank you for saying that. Yeah, that like when I hear that, it's so rural, right? Like that's how rural communities thrive. And a couple months ago in my hometown, there was a very devastating fire in the Shenandoah National Park that came down into our town, and just the community response of helping each other, the community's response to the first responders, a childhood friend of mine who owns a local restaurant, taking food to the families that were displaced during the fires. And so yeah, that's a very rural resilience, right? Like it's community, knowing that you can sort of rely on each other in that way. And again, my student from Malawi was saying that's her rural too, that people, there's a lake that goes through Malawi, a river, and that's where neighbors and community members and people from different tribes, different languages, but they're all there, fishing and, being out in the community. The kids are playing together. And so we were just commenting the other day that we had, couldn't be more worlds apart, and yet have had really similar experiences as children growing up in our rural spaces. So I think that's universal.
just going to say that's so beautiful. I
Yeah,
love that. Amy, I feel like we could record 10 more episodes talking about different topics. But for the sake of today's, I'm going to ask you my final question, which is
sure.
what advice would you give a rural? I mean, I'm sure you do this all the time. You give people starting their career in rural education advice, but what advice would you give a teacher starting their career in a rural school?
Oh my goodness. Well, I've had this wonderful opportunity with my colleagues and some of my closest friends, to write a book called "Teaching in Rural Places," and the subtitle is "Thriving in Rural Schools and Communities." That's not quite right. Schools, classrooms, and communities. "Thriving in Rural Places" is the name of the book. And I would say we took the five of us, we took a lot of our research and a lot of our experiences. And, I don't know if it reads like advice, but I hope that people who come across that book would see that as a resource to get started. And I think if I had to distill, into a piece of advice, again, thinking about the communities that I work with, I would say to be ready to be inspired, right? To be open, to be open to the opportunities, because a lot of I think it's very difficult right now to be a teacher in any setting. And I think it is a very challenging job. But I think if you're every day willing to be inspired, right? And you're every day willing to see the opportunities in that rural community, then you will not you will be successful. And I think I think that's the advice. Yeah, I think that's the advice.
I think that's pretty incredible advice. And along with a link to the Lua project, I've linked in our show notes for this episode your book, Teaching Rural Places, Classrooms, and Communities. And now I think I said it wrong. Teaching in Rural Places, Thriving in Classrooms, Schools, and Communities.
There we go. That's the
But
title.
I've linked that as well with your
Yeah,
co-authors to the show notes here.
wonderful. Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much for coming today and sharing about the work you do at Virginia Tech and in supporting the Center for Rural Education, the center that you founded. I'm so grateful for your time.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This is a joy.
And thank you, everybody who tuned in today. Thanks for listening to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and share this episode. Be the first to know when we have a new episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or have a suggestion for an episode, email us at podcast@fullmindlearning.com.